This is Arab Talk on KPOO, San Francisco, 89.5 FM. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And this is Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have an absolutely great show today. We've got a lot of room to cover. We're going to be talking about the vicious attacks on Representative Ilhan Omar in the Congress and talking about the context for that. But we're also very, very fortunate to have in studio with us today Professor Hatem Bazian. Professor Bazian is a professor at UC Berkeley. He teaches in the Ethnic Studies Department. He teaches at Bolt Law School. He's also the founder and the head of the Islamophobic Study Center at Berkeley. So we're going to be talking with Professor Bazian today about all these issues, but more importantly, this kind of watershed and groundbreaking article that came out in the New Yorker just within the last week, written by Adam Entus, who wrote about, basically wrote about this pervasive, systematic, psychological operation that has been targeting pro-Palestine activists, former Mossad agents, heavily funded over decades to the tune of, we don't even know how much money, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. So, Jamal, we have a lot to cover today. And I think, with everything, I think we should contextualize it by talking about Ilhan Omar, Representative Omar, because really we're at a major inflection point right now. Mm-hmm. The context within which she's been viciously attacked across the political spectrum. We should probably start with that as a context.
So just for the context for our listeners, of course, we're going to talk about the attacks, the vicious attacks on Representative Ilhan Omar, the first Somali Muslim American woman in Congress. And we're going to also connect it with Dr. Hatem Bazian on the article that was pretty much featured, Dr. Bazian, how a private Israeli intelligence firm spied on pro-Palestinian activists in the United States. But I want to start first because this is the title of our show. Are these attacks Islamophobic, the attacks on Ilhan Omar? Or if she were someone, another congressman or congresswoman, would she have been attacked in this ferocity?
Well, I think if we look at the attacks on Ilhan Omar, from that moment she got elected, and even before she got elected, there was a concerted effort to demonize her and try to make some type of a connection. You have the attack coming that she is part of the Brotherhood movement, that she has been working or have attended care functions, that she has spoken or tweeted statements out in 2012 in response to the Gaza attack. So what we see is the structural pattern of demonization was being unleashed on Ilhan Omar and simultaneously on Rashida Tlaib in Michigan.
Right.
And what we are seeing is the pro-Israel Zionist infrastructure in the United States as early as the mid-1990s, shifting its strategy from their perceptions or their approach of targeting the PLO and what they consider to be Palestinian PLO organizations to shifting to the primary target and rationale to targeting anyone that have association with Islam or Muslimness. And in this sense, they developed an Islamophobic campaign, beginning with, if you remember, the Clinton adoption of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in response to an emergency that took place in Israel, which was the first time in the history of the United States that a national state of emergency is declared, not because something occurred in the U.S., but it's something that occurred in Israel. And Clinton declared the state of emergency that targeted individuals and organizations. And from that point on, we see the instrumentalization of Islamophobic discourse by pro-Israel organizations and groups domestically and internationally. Post 9/11, we know that there was a whole report that was produced by Frank Luntz on how to speak to the American public and the Western public in relations to partnering or making the war on terrorism to be identical to Israel's contestation and continued attack and frustrations of the Palestinians. So you began to say that the United States has Osama bin Laden. We have the Yasser Arafat, so he was demonized at that time. You have Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda, we have Hamasistan in Gaza. So this was a PR strategy to try to link Israeli political speech and political propaganda in the U.S. and Europe with the U.S. Propaganda and support for the war on terror that was adopted by the Bush administration. So this is what you're seeing, that Israel is no longer able to actually make any argument logically, since we don't teach logic anymore. They can't make the argument logically about why they need to occupy the Palestinians, why they need to continue to build settlements, why do they need to build walls, why they continue to kill Palestinians almost on a daily basis. So the only way for them to continue their rationale is to use the Islamophobic discourse, and any type of target emerging or at any time, university or otherwise, they'll highlight it and begin to rally Islamophobic content in order to rationalize them, and then connect that to some type of anti-Semitism that is at the core, almost biologically, can be attributed to the Muslim subject in this discourse. And I think this is what Ilhan Omar is facing.
So, Hatem, at the same time, that's a really excellent kind of historical unfolding of this kind of conflation of interest between, let's say, Israeli interests, security interests, and U.S. security interests. And then sometime in, after 2010, when we were seeing an erosion of kind of narratives and descriptions and articulations of Palestinians' rights to self-determination, we saw the emergence and the birth of the BDS movement.
Sure.
Initially, that BDS movement was poo-pooed, as we know, and we remember the infamous remark that was made by Netanyahu and other scholars that this is a mere irritant and will go away in no time. Unfortunately for them, unfortunately for the rest of the world, the BDS movement has grown exponentially and is one of the largest nonviolent campaigns to basically call attention to the occupation of Palestine, the attacks on pro-Palestine activists, and an attempt to hold the State of Israel accountable for its war crimes. I wonder if you could articulate in the same historical vein the kind of evolving anxiety about the BDS movement, because I think it dovetails with Ilhan Omar's attack, and that will segue into our discussion about what happened to you.
Sure. If I could also take the discussion a little bit earlier in history. I think the first Gulf War is very important juncture in Palestinian activism, organizing, advocacy in the United States. The Gulf War ushered two things simultaneously. On the one hand, the disruption of Palestinian society in the diaspora in the Gulf, which was a main source for support for Palestinians who are studying abroad. So Palestinians used to come from Kuwait, from United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, and also Palestinians from Jordan, possibly Syria, the West Bank, Lebanon. They used to come to the United States to study, but they're funded by their families that used to work in the Gulf. So the Gulf War actually cut that process and that support. So all of a sudden, you have Palestinians that were not coming to U.S. campuses, and therefore there was a shift and a change in the nature of organizing. The second is that also as we get into 1991-92, this was the total collapse of South Africa and apartheid system and the end of apartheid, which if those who are involved or were involved during that period one aspect of the anti-apartheid movement actually was a demand that was put in many of the committees is to actually have sanctions on Israel,
Right.
because Israel was breaking the armed embargo on South Africa, and therefore what you have is a coalescing of
Right.
initial engagement of the pro-Palestine activism with the South Africa.
Right.
This would be a point where college campuses, in particular UC Berkeley, the beginning of the creation of Students for Justice in Palestine. It actually emerges in 1992, 93. And from that point on, the campus nature of organizing takes a different dimensionality than what you have of GUPS, the General Union of Palestine Students, which used to be the primary line of work on college campuses. Move forward to the 2005 call for PDS by Palestinian civil society. That call already resonated
Right.
with a political landscape and an activist body, both in the United States, Europe, and other places, that have embraced the Palestinian cause as a cause to rally globally, considering that Israel has historically aligned itself with some of the most regressive policies, both in the United States and Europe. We just need to remind the listeners that Israel was engaged in Latin American death squads,
campaigns.
torture campaigns. They were actually the subcontractors in the death squads in El Salvador. They were heavily involved in the Guatemala genocide that occurred. They were also involved in Africa, in the war in Zaire, the war in Angola, the war in Eritrea. So there, again, if you wanted to have a brand advertisement, my recommendation is Israel is not a good brand for you to attach your claim on it.
Exactly.
So they come into post-2005, the failure of what's called the war on terror. So the PDS comes in at the right moment from Palestinian civil society, and then it begins to pick steam. I'm not surprised that Netanyahu and the Zionists responded in the way they responded, because that's how power responds. Power only looks at itself in the mirror and says, I'm beautiful, because they are unable to see beyond themselves, and therefore the emperor had no clothes in relation to Netanyahu. So it was an obvious understanding from their part that these are just a bunch of people that just on the margins, in the same way that South African apartheid regime responded to.
Until they changed, by the way, to calling BDS as an existential threat,
Right.
which is a term Israel reserved initially to Iran,
Sure,
really,
sure.
not even to the Palestinian Fatah Party or Hamas, maybe sometimes Hezbollah, but to Iran, going from something that they've mocked, really,
Yes.
to say that BDS now is an existential threat.
So that's
And
that's my question to you, Hatem. How did it go from simply an irritant to an existential threat in such a short period of time?
Well, again, from a person that was engaged in the South Africa anti-apartheid movement, I would actually like to express my, at least from a laughing point, thanks to the Israeli, that once your own target or your own emphasis on Israel highlight your strategy, they become your advertising campaign. So in this sense, I'm thankful for a state that have elevated the profile of the PDS movement to be an existential threat for a country that have nuclear weapons, at least if we follow Vinunu's argument, possibly 500 or 600 warheads. Right? But again, it actually points to their insecurity and their inability to maintain the levers of power and the level of propaganda discourse both in the United States and Europe. So the elevation of the PDS is a result of their missteps. I think they miscalculated in their 4 attacks on Gaza because they thought that just because the White House is muted and silenced does not mean that the large public in the United States, Europe, and much of the world is not actually silent. They lost the social media. They lost the activist advocates on civil society in Europe, the United States, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So the miscalculation on their part in relation to the 4 attacks on Gaza, the attack on Lebanon, which was completely disaster, and then one has to actually make the point that Netanyahu's what you call approach to his political engagement with the United States, almost slapping the U.S. political elite time and time again. And no more clearer than this when he actually marched into the Congress to challenge a sitting president. And I think there is an aspect in there in terms of racial discourse. I'm not a fan of Obama. I wrote a piece on him in relations to the drones attack and how he had joined the dark side. So, but on the question of Israel, if you remember, as soon as he gave his Cairo speech, which wanted to shift and change and critique Israel, that's when the whole apparatus flipped against him.
That's right.
And Netanyahu marching into Congress, being clapped upon and having more standing ovation than a sitting president.
Against the will, by the way, of the White House.
Against the will of the White House and so on. So he's saying that I am the boss here. I could tell you what needs to be done. And the Republicans, who actually were acting from narrow self-interest, wanted actually to reduce the credibility of Obama because they were setting themselves up for the upcoming election. They actually celebrated Netanyahu making that act. What's important in here, that Israel became a partisan issue after a long period of time of becoming something that both parties agreed upon. Now you have actually occurring a shift in the United States among the large population within the Democratic Party, and I think we're seeing some of this effect as we speak today.
This is Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. I also want to welcome our viewers on Facebook Live. With us for the entire hour is Dr. Hatem Bazian, and we're talking about BDS. We're talking about the vicious attacks against Representative Ilhan Omar, and also the silencing of academia on college campuses, which we've discussed that before. So, taking us back to BDS, and I think the probably prior to now, what we're seeing in Congress, the most vicious attacks happened on college campuses.
True.
And you were targeted. You were one of the targets. Other professors also were targeted.
Actually, one of the largest targets, Jamal, really, if you want to talk about it.
So before we start talking about what happened when they attacked you in particular, how did we kind of evolve from going from college campuses to the back doors and hallways of Congress to actually now putting a bill, to penalize institutions, companies, individuals who support BDS?
Yeah. Again, I look at it from a bigger and a longer strategy dynamics. The fact that Israel and its political muscle in the U.S., whether it's AIPAC, ADL, JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council, or American Jewish Committee, or Zionist Organization of America, and the whole Blue Network, which is this document speaks about, their attempt to try to shift the parameter by instituting laws that restricts the ability of individuals to engage in PDS is an important development from my perspective for the advocates of PDS. And I don't think of it as a loss, but actually it's shifting the boundaries of the debate.
Yes.
I think in here, not that I want to give the pro-Israel any type of strategic advice. It seems that
they're good at helping us anyways.
They're fumbling their way because they only are determining their actions by means of the measure of power and ability to try to close the doors for engaging in the debate and the discussion. So by instituting these legislation, whether in congressional level or in 25 states, have shifted the boundaries of debate from expressing your point of view on PDS and supporting PDS or not, whether you can be engaging in pro-Palestinian speech or pro-Israeli speech, to shifting the boundary into actually constitutional right. Mm-hmm. Am I, as an American, able to engage in a speech that is at least as a standing law from Supreme Court decisions that boycott is a form of sanctioned speech and sanctioned action? So it shifted the boundary into a discussion about the First Amendment right, constitutional right. And I think this is a winnable case for us across the board. It might take some time. It might frustrate some individual. We might face setbacks, but I'm confident that this case is a winnable case. speaking directly from my experience. I was invited to give a speech at Arizona State University. So the contract was sent to me to sign, and item 20, if I'm remembering, says that I will actually commit myself during my engagement in this contract not to engage in PDS. My speech at Arizona State University was supposed to be on PDS. So in here, it's a prior restraint. It's actually a university. Again, I could understand maybe a
they
private...
tried to do that for the hurricane victims in Texas.
In Texas. So I refused to sign the contract and filed a lawsuit against the university and against the state of Arizona that this law is constituting a constitutional violation of my right.
Where's that lawsuit now?
Well, the university withdrew the contract, so I don't need to sign it. So I actually went and spoke on PDS at Arizona State University. They no longer have the language in their contract.
Wow.
Right? And they're still going through the process with Arizona to challenge the law. All indication that the law will actually either be rescinded or be transformed. And I think there's another case that we are engaged in Texas, similarly with the teacher that was required to actually sign the contract. So she refused to sign the contract and is being challenged. Another case in Kansas. So that the legal changes are taking place is going to walk all the way through to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court have enough precedent on the rights of boycott. The ironic thing that Arizona itself had a number of boycotts of cities in California because of the sanctuary movement.
I remember
so you could boycott San Francisco, you could boycott Berkeley, you could boycott LA or Portland, right? But you cannot boycott Israel. Now, if that does not vex you as an American, that you think that you have the freedom of speech, freedom of organizing, and all the enjoyable freedom that the Constitution gives, but you have limits that you can't actually boycott a foreign country, right, that receives $3 billion plus annually from the budget. So for me, that's their miscalculation about thinking that at a certain point you could silence people's mouths and limit their ability to critique you and try to label it that this is a form of anti-Semitism. And I think that's their miscalculations. Ironically enough, not that I want to praise the ADL agrees with me on this in this
Maybe
point.
the only time they've agreed with you.
Well, maybe they were spying on me so much that they took my language and put it as a recommendation, but I'll leave it that to them.
That's the voice of Professor Hatem Bezian. Joining us here on Arab Talk, Professor Bezian is professor at UC Berkeley. He teaches in the Ethnic Studies Department as well as Bolt Law School. He's the founder and director of the Islamophobia.
I used to teach at Bolt, so not in the present.
Not at the current, but I know you used to.
Because again, I'm expecting that some of our friends who are going to be watching, they're going to book this as the red herring that they might critique. You see, there's a factual
So he's not teaching there right now.
Yeah, just to be accurate, just being myself is a stimulus to the economy, so I want to those who are employed to accurately transcribe, so they don't have to go to Bolt to try to check that fact.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of push this a little bit because we're on this kind of historical trajectory of getting to where we are today. And I just wanted to interject on the boycott thing. You can even boycott Trump Tower, Trump hotels, but you can't boycott Israel according to this.
Absolutely.
These bills. So
and again,
that's the irony, right?
Look at some of the pro-Israel organizations on campus and off campus. They were actually very strongly on behalf of the boycott on Sudan, the Darfur movement. Praiseworthy. One cannot talk. The whole boycott of Iran and asking for sanctions of Iran, the boycott on Libya and the sanctions of Libya, the boycott on Iraq and the sanctions of Iraq. Right? So what makes you having the right to push and support boycotts across these various arenas, but when it comes to actually calling for boycott of Israel, you say, no, this is a form of anti-Semitism.
Right.
You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Well, speaking of that cake, Professor Bezian, that kind of brings us to the vicious attacks on Representative Ilhan Omar. Now, maybe, I don't know if I'm overstating it, but it appears that this is a bit of a historical inflection point because the only issue really in the American electorate or the American legislative scene prior to recently where there was the appearance of unanimity was on the question of Israel. It's really the only place where the elite in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party really came together pretty much unequivocally. Because of the attacks on Representative Omar, there has been a dramatic pushback by more liberal and progressive forces within the Democratic Party. Do you really see this as a possible important historical moment where we are today?
Again, going back, I think the shift in the Democratic Party begins with the sustained attack on Obama. And that attack, and also Israel political elite predominantly becoming Likudist and becoming more extreme right, and embracing and looking in the United States to link their or hitch their wagon on the right wing of the United States, the religious right, in particular the Republican Party, segments of the Tea Party, and also similar type of political relations in Europe. You would see that Israel relations with the Netherlands in terms of Geert Wilders, who heads a neo-Nazi party. Marie Le Pen in France also heads a neo-Nazi party. Her father, again, a sick puppy that the French put him in jail because of his hobby. You could have many hobbies, but his hobby is to collect Nazi memorabilia. All right. So his daughter, Marie Le Pen, is the leader of the French right wing, and she was given a red carpet welcome in Israel. Similarly, the relationship with the British right wing, including Farage being given welcome in Israel. And recently, Israel have embraced, or Netanyahu embraced the new Brazilian president, who also likewise a fascist in terms of background. So that shift in Israel, shift to the extreme right, had its reflection in here. So AIPAC and much of its operative have become, again, reflective of Israeli politics, rotating the domestic American Zionist orientation to the right wing, and thus losing a considerable base within the Democratic Party. Obama is still one of the most popular figures. This is not a critique of his policies. We could have a different discussions for that. So that movement have continued to develop, culminating with Netanyahu's again speech in Congress, and moving into the direction now that the Democratic Party is very split on the question of Palestine. Another dimension to remember, there was a discussion, if you remember, during the last convention, the Democratic Convention, when the plank on Jerusalem, where a voice vote was taking place, it was clear that the delegates to the Democratic Party did not want that plank. They had to go through it twice. I think that dynamic will begin to actually intensify moving up in the 2020 election. The grassroots have already shifted on the question of Palestine. It's no longer
That's not an issue anymore.
It's not an issue. And that also can be added another dimension to it, which is the emergence of the Black Lives Matter and the solidarity that has emerged.
That's right.
A real solidarity has emerged between the Black Lives Matter activists and the Palestinian activists, especially around the protests in Ferguson, and the critical role that was played by Palestinians in relations to communication and solidarity. It's not surprising that Professor Mark Lamontel was part of the delegation that was organized by a number of individuals from the Black Lives Matter, and that also consolidated the shift among certain segments of the African American activists, that the shift, you could actually look at it from the early to mid-'60s with Malcolm X and that movement, and then also the role of some of the progressive movements, whether Black Panthers and others, that adopted and embraced third world anti-colonial struggles and liberation struggles, and Palestine was part and parcel of that. But it took over 20 to 30 years for that consolidation. So I think we have a very important opportunity right now that Ilhan is sitting at the tipping point of riding that consolidation that is beginning to take place.
So you know who the biggest support for Ilhan Omar was behind the scenes? It was the Congressional Black Caucus.
Oh, absolutely. Again,
isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. Again, and I have an article coming up in a week that speaks about the shift in relations to black African Americans and black movements domestically in the United States, but also transnationally in relations to Palestine, and where are these spikes in relations to the solidarity? So often that case relative to the Black Caucus and the leadership of African American civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement, and where Palestine featured. Andrew Young was a painful episode for African Americans. Here's an icon of the civil rights movement, and he was completely pushed out from being the United States representative to the UN for the sole reason of actually meeting with the PLO. While other figures within the U.S. landscape were meeting with the PLO behind doors all the time, but because he is representative or a symbol of a particular type of struggle, he actually was dealt with in a complete disrespectful way. And then you look at Jesse Jackson during the Rainbow Coalition in 1984 and 1988, and how he was dealt with. Jesse Jackson was a transnational, reflective. Again, one can disagree on some of the elements relative to Jesse Jackson. That's not the issue. But symbolically, he was carrying the legacy of the civil rights movement from the period of Martin Luther King. He was engaged transnationally and was an international figure. But because of his embrace of the Palestinian, or readiness to express positions on Palestine, made him almost a persona non grata relative to the Democratic Party. So it's been a long struggle to get to this point, and I think what we need is not that only Ilhan is knocking on the door. She broke the door, and she's in there.
Down.
Deal with it. And yesterday she said in one of her statements, she said, I have the same certificate of membership in Congress like everyone else.
Right.
She was pointing to the Democratic leadership who's telling her, in essence, whether indirect or indirect, that you need to what you call shape up.
Shape up or ship out.
Right? As like she doesn't, or the Democratic leadership across the board, they don't know there's a new sheriff.
She was elected.
There's a new sheriff in town, and it does not report to Netanyahu for the position that they need to take, and they don't need to answer to AIPAC. And that's basically what is taking place as in front of our eyes.
I want to shift the conversation because we're halfway in the show to really talk about, which I think it was a great article, this campaign codenamed Project Butterfly. For our listeners, probably some of our listeners are not familiar with the latest revelations, and it's an article in the New Yorker that featured Dr. Hatem Bazian.
It's a very disturbing story.
It talks
frankly.
about a Psy group's operation against BDS activists on U.S. college campuses, which began in February 2016, according to internal documents describing the campaign. And the company raised money in New York from Jewish American donors and pro-Israel groups and assured them that their identities would be kept secret. And of course, it goes further, but not only this, but also they receive tax deductions, which I think it's a big thing because we know that similar groups, or in a different way, they're under investigation by what the equivalent of the U.S. Treasury in Canada, right?
Yes.
So this is now they're investigating this, and if this is going if this is going to trigger later on maybe an investigation. So you're prominently featured in this article.
Yes.
Obviously, they say 2016, but I think it's longer than this. It doesn't sound like 2016.
Well, I think what we need to break this into a number of pieces.
Okay.
Have I been a target of various aspects of the Israeli intelligence network in the United States, whether be it in the guise of the private Mossad or Mossad on loan and various aspects? I would say absolutely.
Mossad for hire.
Mossad for hire. I think also I've been a target of the ADL,
Yes.
one of their primary target. I've been one of the primary target of JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council. So I understand and have enough evidence to point to this systematic targeting for the longest period of time. Now, in here, what we have is a new development, and I think there was an article in the Jewish Forward just a couple of days ago that pointed to the shift that occurred in Israel, that we are the recipient or the aspect of the changes that we're witnessing relative to this dynamic. That in 2015, a report that was prepared for Israel in 2010 was adopted to have a much more hard edge targeting and direct targeting of individuals that are behind of the PDS. And Erdogan, who was become the minister of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel, takes on that role. So my sense is that there's a qualitative shift that takes place. And then we'll get into this private Mossad for hire. Now, it's important to actually say that this is a private company, meaning it's operating under the guise of for-profit as a front. This is to bypass U.S. law. U.S. law prohibits intelligence organization from abroad, from a foreign country, to operate in the U.S. They have to register as agents of a foreign country, and they have to go through the procedure. So this quote, Mossad for hire ex-agents, from all my reading of the document, again, I have the primary document in front of me, it smells, tastes, and looks like a Mossad operation that is in coordination with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. If it quacks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
Well,
so it's a Mossad duck that's operating in here.
We also know from prior examples like the assassination that happened in Mabhouh in the UAE. They use Canadian, Australian passports and other, so...
Yeah, but in here, again, they're operating as a company.
As a private company.
Private company. They solicited funding. They ran a test case. It says that they mapped anti-Israel hubs nationwide, initiated, implemented of targeting plans, organizations, and individuals. They conducted 2 tours of main theater of action. That's, again, a military terminology, theater of action that they're using, executing intelligence and influence efforts, collaborating with partners. So, again, the partners, they refer to it as the Blue Network partners, executed 5 rapid response operations nationwide. And then they go on. Availability for future investment, they were actually calling for $2.5 million investment in this operation in order to target. Now, what made this apparent is that in 2017, which the article opens up with it, is that my own street, my own car, the cars of everyone up and down my street in my neighborhood was covered with all these flyers that called me, and then Rebecca Volkerson from JVP, who's in New York, putting us in the flyers, calling us terrorists, and so on. And that was up and down the street, meaning there was a specific targeting that took place. They also dumped a whole bunch of flyers in downtown Berkeley, and at the same time, at the same exact day, a whole operation was run from New York. This indicates that there is actually a whole campaign that is coordinated, that is being managed. It's not, I run nonprofit, I work with nonprofit. This is not a nonprofit type of operation. This is someone that have resources and have infrastructure to run. And this was also following another campaign of having posters that were flooding the campus, both at San Francisco State, at UC Berkeley, UCLA.
Well, we know about these posters, and we know about Canary Mission and Campus Watch and wherever, because this, of course, requires more than the $2.5 million. And we know for a fact that the San Francisco Jewish Community Federation has spent in excess of $300 million funding a bunch of these organizations, from
the San Francisco office,
from Canary Mission to Campus Watch. You've mentioned the Dutch extremist Wilders. He received money from them. ACT, Pamela Geller's organization in New York, and so forth. So it's bigger, I think.
No, I think what we need is to, what you call, separate the different ducks that are on the pond.
I think there are a lot of live ducks. I think they're all connected.
They are connected. Again, they all operate under what's called the Blue Network. Right? Now, the San Francisco Jewish Federation, I don't know about the $300 million. I think they spend a lot. Some of it is legitimate. I don't want to, what you call, be over emphasizing how much they do support synagogues, very positive. They support their community center, very positive. Athletic programs, very positive. They do support some refugee resettlement, very positive. That's not what the beef I have with them. The beef I have is that I have their 990 tax returns,
Right.
and I know that from their tax returns 990 that they supported Geert Wilder in the Netherlands. We have a specific amount, $25,000, that they have in their tax return that they gave this individuals who was one of the most despicable Islamophobe on the world.
In the world.
In the world.
Absolutely.
I just want to put an update here. The House has just passed the resolution. I think it's 407 to 23. So
What-
the resolution,
What's which resolution?
well, the last version that I've seen condemning anti-Semitism and supposed to condemn anti-Islam.
They also included
and
Islamophobia.
whatever. But I mean, it's still kind of on the heels of
And
the
they didn't
attacks
have-
on
they didn't
Ilhan
have-
Omar.
Yeah.
But supposedly it shouldn't have her name in it.
It's not.
In
I
that-
know for sure before. I know the text.
Okay.
I got it beforehand. I know it does not include her. I know that the language is actually it's a loss for AIPAC, even though that the vote.
How so? How so, Hatem?
Because AIPAC was going hard that they wanted to punish Ilhan.
Right.
And this morning there was an article in the Jerusalem Post that the AIPAC has overreached. They did not actually account for the contradictions and the various forces that are present in Congress. So while they're happy that the language on anti-Semitism is included, and I don't think anybody would disagree that
We don't.
anti-Semitism is a problem.
No, we
The
don't.
language they use actually is very positive language in critiquing anti-Semitism. But also they dropped few, again, for the AIPAC to save face about this special relationship between Israel and the United States. And all that, again, is just a gift to AIPAC. But the key factor in here, one, is they included Islamophobia as an aspect. Second, that Ilhan was not attacked
Personally, she was not mentioned.
in there. Third, is it actually now speaks of bigotry as a larger issue rather than in a very narrow way. So again, politics is a contact sport. And in here, one has to assess that AIPAC thought that they had what you call
knockout.
They had a knockout
And they
on
didn't.
they had a knockout on Monday. Now comes first, it was delayed. Thursday, now they don't have a knockout. Rather, they have to take another round and accept that everybody can hold hand today, right? And sing "We Are the World." That Ilhan is still will
How
be.
much do you think they underestimated? I mean, the fact of the matter that Ilhan Omar, number one, she's a Muslim woman. She wears the hijab. She's a Somali refugee.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think if she didn't fit all these
Well, let me give you
buckets,
let me give
they
you,
would have not come this hard?
Ilhan did not back down.
A second,
Right?
she didn't.
So she didn't. I think there was a speech that she gave yesterday, a very positive speech that she expressed exactly where she's at. She didn't back down. But also one has to give credit that the community mobilized. I was part of the national strategy to respond to it. We were able to pull a coalition together. Almost 800 different individuals and groups signed on the letter that was released. There was a press conference yesterday, and then there were people that moved. My own organization, American Muslims for Palestine, was part of the organizing group. I know CARE was there, and a whole bunch of other Empower. So we actually, in literally 36 hours,
And Jewish
Voice for Peace,
and so
if
she
not
has-
now.
Yeah.
So again,
Black Lives Matter.
the reason that Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, because again, you have to know that this was a democratic resolution.
Right.
This was adopted to try to what you call save themselves, so they would not go into the 2020 election being accused that they're soft on anti-Semitism, soft on this issue. And we have, again, if you think about who's in the White House as a president, who said there are some good people in the Charlottesville, these are neo-Nazis that were running. Nobody took him to task. So again, the Democratic leadership was put to the test, and there was a massive mobilization, meaning that the pressure works and the people are mobilized, and they're sick and tired of the same type of politics that we have to respond to what Netanyahu and AIPAC wants us to do. And I think this is a moment that is very critical, even though that they passed this resolution, but it affirms that AIPAC is no longer the king of the hill, and the king has no clothes. And I think that's what we need to go out with this message, even though that it did not give us completely what we want in terms of knocking the resolution.
But it is a big shift, Hatem.
It is, no, absolutely. That's how we need to understand it.
We have to understand this as a dramatic, profound
Sure.
shift where Nancy Pelosi was confronted. The elite of the Democratic Party were confronted. And I don't know how many times in the past they've blinked when AIPAC has told them to do what they did.
No, absolutely.
But they blinked.
Sure.
And
Again, this
is a big deal.
Sure.
I just want to remind our listeners, Jamal, that we're listening to Professor Hatem Bazian, professor at UC Berkeley.
One of the founders of the Zaytuna
College.
Zaytuna College. Is it Zaytuna University now?
Zaytuna College.
College still. Also founder and director of Islamophobic Studies Center at UC Berkeley. I want Professor Bazian, if you could just finish the story about, we're speaking in this context of psyops and psychological operations, but we're really missing how profoundly they attacked you and your family.
Oh, sure.
And I don't want to lose sight of this, that
it's
you
a
and your
personal
family got
attack.
attacked.
Yeah,
it was a vicious attack.
It's a vicious attack. It's an attack on my family, my home, where I live. When I can understand the campus politics, I'm a veteran in the ins and outs of politics. If you're going to come and knock on my door, you better be ready, because I'm going to give as much as you can take, and I'm not going to be your therapist when you knock my door. So again, I know, but when they target you at home, now this is an escalation that they're undertaking. But let me also get the picture bigger.
Okay.
There are massive infusion of resources that are being deployed, both on targeting pro-Palestine, pro-PDS activists, SJP on college campuses and nationally, and also the Islamophobic industry. I wrote an article in the American Studies Association Journal. I estimated 3.5 years ago, that 70% of the funding for the Islamophobia industry come from pro-Israel sources. I'm right now confident that I could actually escalate that percentage to 80% of the funding to the Islamophobia industry in the United States come from pro-Israel sources. In the last election, 2016, we have Robert Mercer putting Islamophobic ads that targeted white sections of the country with these Islamophobic ads, these $2.5 million just like a pop.
Right.
Similarly, we know that he's actually engaged in a similar type of campaign of demonization toward the Muslim population. Haim Saban, who actually is a major funder for the Democratic Party, where his interest is constantly to preserve and promote Israel's interest, as well as Sheldon Adelson, they held a Las Vegas summit to try to actually develop this strategy.
They raised $60 million there.
And they raised $60 million. Again, in here, I want to make sure that our audience, just because these individuals are Jewish, does not mean that we want to blame them because of Jewishness, because also some of the major supporters of Israel come from the Christian right for their own purposes.
Right.
So while we want to critique Haim Saban and Sheldon Adelson, we should not miss the point that their ease of operation and ease of work in this country is because they are operating in a hospitable environment that sees the confrontation between Jewish and Muslim as part of an end-of-time scenario, and we need to be smart at it. However, that some of the major Jewish organizations here, organized Jewish organizations, aside from Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, and others, have hitched their wagon to Islamophobia. This also gets me to AJC, the American Jewish Committee, which has been partnering with ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, to counter Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But time and time again, they actually have resorted and went back to Islamophobia. Their executive director, David Harris, who often put these spots on the radio that are heavily Islamophobic, they gave the Courage Award to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. They opposed Keith Ellison's election for the chairman of the Democratic Party. And just all their activists the past week, if you also look their Facebook, their Twitter, their statements actually heavily Islamophobic toward Ilhan Omar. So what kind of alliance, what type of coalition you want to defeat Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, where every opportunity that to speak and actually come to defend and stand by Muslims when it counts the most toward empowerment and raising their status, they actually opt to use Islamophobia. So that's where massive resources, and our report with CARE documenting the Islamophobia industry with 215 million that's spent, I would say 80% of it comes from pro-Israel sources.
And that may be conservative also.
Well, this is what we can document from 990 and tax returns.
That still is probably a little conservative.
I think it's the tip of the iceberg.
Because we don't know how much is
Again,
hidden.
what is a few $1 million between friends?
We've been listening to Professor Hatem Bezian. Professor Bezian is professor at UC Berkeley, teaches in ethnic studies, one of the intellectual leaders in the area of Islamophobia, started the Islamophobia Studies Center, one of the foremost journals on Islamophobia.
The only journal in the world.
Well, then it's the foremost journal
Foremost.
then. And so, but before we let you go, Hatem, I
Well,
want...
it's going to be a positive thing.
Yes.
We want,
It's like, what do you see, the future,
Right.
number one.
And if people want more information about some of the work you're doing, if you could direct them to some websites or some resources if they want to get on board.
Well, they always can access my website that has all my writings and my engagement,
It's a-
hatembazian.com.
It's a really excellent website,
Yeah,
by
so
the
they're
way.
all-
HATAMBAZIAN.com.
So
Yeah.
you HATEM.
Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
it's okay. So Hatem Bazian. You could also Google me at UC Berkeley, but make sure that you're always going to get Campus Watch because
Canary Mission.
I'm an equal opportunity, so I keep a lot of people employed. Being myself is a stimulus to the economy, so at least they'll appreciate this. So you could access our IRDP project, Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project
Excellent
at UC
project.
Berkeley,
Excellent project.
Islamophobia Studies Journal, where we actually write about all this material, so for sure. And really, the future can be impacted by our own action. I'm not a person that asks you to be silent. Silence will not change history. Again, I'm for meditation. Meditate, but after you meditate, I want you to come out
And speak.
So speak truth to power. This is the moment where people are making a change. I think Ilhan Omar is representing that phenomena. I think Rashida is representing that phenomena. I think there's a whole new generation that is engaging and is beginning to understand these linkages. It is also to make a linkage between the local and transnational, between opposing racism domestically and opposing racism internationally, opposing militarism domestically with the police forces that are increasingly becoming militarized, and opposing militarism abroad, the obscene level of capitalism that we're seeing, the distortion of the whole domestic capitalist enterprise, and the globalization that is basically reshaping the world. So they're not
All
disconnected.
interlinked.
Then I also always recommend for my students and everyone, I recommend for you to go and listen to both Malcolm X speeches, but also Martin Luther King, the Three Evils of Society speech.
Yeah.
If you actually go systematically and read it, and just replace the dates with what is taking place
the
today,
same.
it is the same, which is the three evils of society, is materialism, militarism, and racism. These are the three that we confront them, and the fact that they're attacking Ilhan Omar, that represents almost a consolidation of that in terms of her blackness in relative to
Right.
being from Africa. The fact that she's a refugee as a result of the wars that have been imposed, militarism, on people in Somalia and the Horn of Africa for the past 50 to 60 years. This is, again, part and parcel of it. And the fact that she came as a refugee in here and had to struggle in order to make it up.
And in fact, we have Donald Trump attacking refugees and immigrants all the time.
It's different when you are born with a silver spoon in your
That's
mouth or
right.
a gold spoon versus somebody that actually had to struggle just to make it where they are. And again, one says that if you look at Ilhan Omar, she is not part of the millionaire club because it seems that's the
She's
only way
not.
for you make it to Congress. So it's an interesting that some of the three leading voices right now in Congress, or at least the new maybe 20, none of them belong to that
millionaires.
class. So we need to actually bring the people to the people's house, the Congress, in order for us to begin to shift on the priorities. And I think this is part of the dynamic that we need to be putting forward.
Well, on this note, and I think it's a very good point that you were making, I want to thank you for coming to our studio as usual, Dr. Hatem Bazian. I want to encourage our listeners to go to our website, ArabTalkRadio.com, where you could download our apps and you could listen to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and of course, I want to thank all of our listeners in the Bay Area on KPOO 89.5 FM and our viewers on Facebook Live.
We'll see you next week.